Good afternoon, this is Quintus Curtius, and this is the second lecture in a projected series of 3 on my new book, which is an annotated and illustrated translation of Cicero's On Moral Ends, De Finibus. And in the first lecture from a little over a week ago, we talked about books 1 and 2 of On Moral Ends. And in those 2 books, the discussion centered on Epicureanism, the strengths and weaknesses, the pros and cons of the Epicurean philosophy. And again, our task here is the search for the answers to the question: what is the ultimate good? What is the final ultimate end to which man should direct his efforts in terms of how to live his life? And the first dialogue focused on books 1 and 2, again, as I said, which talked about Epicureanism. So in this podcast, we're going to talk about the second dialogue, which theoretically took place in 52 BC. And we know this just from clues within the text, from little things that are said, who was elected consul here and there, and who said this. And there are references in the text that enable us to date the projected time frames of these dialogues. And the location is in the city of Tusculum, or the town of Tusculum in Italy, which is about, today it's about a 2-hour drive outside of Rome in the Alban Hills. And I'll talk a little bit about what that area is like when I visited it in May of this year. Very, very nice place. So the speakers of this dialogue are Cicero himself and Cato, Marcus Cato, the famous Roman Stoic. And, I probably should have said this at the outset of the podcast here, but I'll put a link to the book on my site on this, the announcement for this podcast. It can be found on Amazon. It's currently available in both Kindle and paperback. Currently, I'm working on a audiobook version of it, and other things may follow down the line as well, which I'll announce as they become available. So some of the reference to the things that I'll talk about in this podcast will refer to the book, so if you do have it, it's maybe a good time to get that out and refer to it as you wish. Maybe not. Do what you want. It's a free country. So, before we really get into the dialogue here about Stoicism, I want to say just sort of some important things that I think should be seen as takeaways from this, from the treatment of Stoicism in On Moral Ends. Everybody talks about Stoicism now. It seems to be especially with young guys, it's a very popular philosophy, and it has a great deal to commend itself for. Its merits will become apparent, and I've written about it often. I've translated Cicero's Stoic paradoxes. I've written on many things, Stoic themes. But I sometimes wonder if people have gotten a little bit too carried away with their enthusiasm for Stoicism, because like any philosophical system, it had merits, and it also had demerits. It had strengths and weaknesses. And that's fine. Not every philosophical system is going to be perfect. You can't get everything right. Actually, who even knows what's right when it comes to philosophical systems? That's a whole separate debate unto itself. But Stoicism has a great deal to commend itself for, and I'm very, very much in favor of many of its teachings. But on the other hand, we also have to be mindful of its shortcomings, and everyone forgets this. Nobody really wants to talk about it. And I suspect that it really comes down to the reality that most people really have a very superficial knowledge of Stoicism. When you really come right down to it, they really haven't done the heavy lifting. They haven't read they haven't really studied, say, Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius, Cicero, the writings of Seneca, or if they have, what they've really done is throw around a few platitudes, a few aphorisms, and they think that that makes them an expert on Stoicism. It ain't so. It ain't so. There are a lot of things here that present problems and that should be reflected on in an intelligent way. Now, I don't want anyone to interpret this as a muted attack on Stoicism, but I think it's very good that Cicero, in his book, is not afraid to bring out the big guns and to really attack the Stoics on many different levels. And some of his criticisms have real traction. Some of them really, really carry a lot of weight. And I think this is one of the things that we have to be mindful of as we go through on moral ends, because nobody should really slavishly adhere any system of thought without retaining some sort of faculty for critical examination of its doctrines. We can't just surrender ourselves to worship. We have to retain our intellectual independence as we seek out these ideas and as we discuss them. All right, so let's talk a little bit about Book 3. This is where where Cato gives his disquisition on Stoicism, on the main tenets. And we talked earlier about how this dialogue took place in Tusculum, and when I went there in May, it was such a beautiful trip. I really enjoyed it. I can't, I don't know, maybe it's just me. It's probably just me because I'm just so enthusiastic about this subject matter, about these subjects, that it was one of those moments where I just couldn't believe that I was actually there. I was staying in Rome. So what I did was I got on the train, and there's a very, very good train system in Italy. And I took the train to the town of Frascati, which is in the Alban Hills outside of Rome. And then from there I walked. I walked through the hills to get to this ruin, to the ruins of this town. And it's not an inhabited town right now. It's basically just scattered ruins. But there was hardly anyone there. I was the only one there. There was an archaeological dig going on. As I walked around, the grass was wet everywhere. There was this very nice dew sort of just dripping off the trees. It had rained, or there had been heavy fog the night before. And it was that wonderful moment where the sun is just, because I got an early start in the morning, the sun is just starting to burn off the night's dampness. And, as I looked around, I wondered to myself, man, it probably is true that this area has not really changed very much in, say, 2,200 years. It was just beautiful and very evocative. And I can imagine that's anyone who had a villa, because Cicero had villas at these places. He had like residences. We don't really know exactly what they looked like, but I assume that they were probably nice places, and he would invite friends over. They would talk about probably current events, political events of the day, philosophical subjects, just same things that men today talk about when they're in groups. So that's really why I think that including photographs, and again I keep going back to this, but including photographs of these places in the book on moral ends is such a welcome addition to doing things, because it transports you right to that place. And that's what I wanted to do. I wanted you to be transported right to where I was. And I think when that happens, you can gain something out of this text that you would not be able to gain anywhere else. Don't just take my word for it. Compare my book with others, and you'll see what I mean. And it was just an incredible fortuitous circumstance that as I was in Tusculum, I happened to see a skull being excavated there, right in front of me. I could not believe it. I just could not believe it. But I'm told that these types of things are maybe not regular occurrences in Italy, but they happen frequently because the whole country is just one large open-air museum. The whole country has things in it. You turn over a rock anywhere, and you'll find some footprint of some individual who was there from historical times. So anyway, enough of that. Let's move on here. So basically, in Book 3, Cato starts out, and he gets right down into the subject matter here. He candidly acknowledges the difference, the fact that the Stoics were very, very hung up on terminology. And this is true. This is something Cicero comments on. The Stoics were real sticklers for painstaking hair-splitting, terminological hair-splitting and terminological creation. Okay? And, he starts out really by making a point about where the Stoics depart from the Epicureans. Cato says that organisms do not really hunger for pleasure the way the Epicureans think, but what they really seek is self-preservation. The Epicureans think that one of the fundamental motives and driving impulses of living things is their desire for pleasure. Well, Cato says no, nonsense. He says that it's self-preservation which is really what they are after, and this is in Book 3, sections 20 to 21. Our lives are just not performances to be lived out in any way we please. Okay, just as an actor or dancer has a special role to perform on stage, so must our lives, Cato says, be conducted in a certain way. Okay, and if we look at things in this way, it is clear that moral goodness is the only true good. All right, and he says this very specifically in Book 3, section 31. He says, therefore, we must conclude that the supreme good is to live by applying our knowledge of nature's causative forces, selecting the things that are in accordance with nature, and rejecting the things that are not. In other words, the supreme good is to live in conformity and alignment with nature. That's one way to encapsulate the Stoic definition of the supreme good. All right. Now, this brings us to a real problem that Cicero talks about later when he attacks Stoicism. How do we really know, or what does it really mean to live in conformity with nature? What does that mean? Isn't it true that the seeds just as often as we can find the seeds of good in nature, we can find evil there as well? So this abstract idealization of nature is a real mistake, is a real shortcoming in many ways that the Stoics indulge in, because it sets up this idealized view of nature that that biologists or people that actually do field work in the natural world will tell you is not really true. I mean, nature is just as dog eat dog. Nature is just as brutally competitive as anything that we find amongst humans. So to say to live in accordance with nature in some ways sets us up for disappointment. Because now, I suppose there are those who can argue, they can say, well, that's not really true. That's not what he's saying. That's not what he's saying. He's saying that we should structure our lives so that we are going with the flow that nature provides and not against it. And that's also a valid point. So we need to probe deeper. The Stoics are indifferent to those things that are neither virtue nor vice. And, Cato then spends a lot of time talking about various classifications, various categories. Some of the best sections of Book 3 are found in Book 3 sections 62 to 66, and they show a very finely tuned awareness of what I think is Stoicism's strong point, which is its sensitivity to social responsibility. When you live in a society, you have obligations. You have to do certain things in order for society to function correctly. And this is really something that matters a lot. Friendship is part of this social equation and should be seen as something desirable for its own sake. And Cato concludes his discourses here with praise for the greatness of the wise man in section 75. And The wise man will always be happy, he says, because he's possessed of moral goodness, and he really doesn't need anything else. He really doesn't need anything else. Now, all I'm really doing is cherry-picking some of the highlights of Book 3. There's a lot here, and you have to read it really for yourself. And I can't, in these podcasts, spend 2 hours here on the mic going through all this, because I have to keep these podcasts to a manageable size or length. But some of the things that we can see from Cato's disquisition on Stoicism, it is that the first thing that it seems very tightly constructed. It's much more logical, much more rigorous, much more dogmatic in many ways than the Epicurean explanation was by Torquatus in the first and second books. So we have to give Stoicism some respect for that. This is a very, very finely honed architecture of thought. It's a very, very finely honed system of thought, and Cicero does give credit for that, even when he criticizes it. But there are immediately some things that jump out at us which are causes for concern. And this is something that jumped out at me as I was translating the book, and I hope it will jump out at you as well. Which I think is really is the biggest, the biggest shortcoming, I think, of Stoicism is its rigidity. It's a harsh rule. It is a harsh rule in many ways. And I say in the introduction that, look, this is maybe a good thing, because it's probably better to err on the side of harshness than on the side of softness, because people's impulses and personalities being what they are, they will take advantage of any perceived weakness and run with it. So we certainly have to set a goal or a standard that may be unrealistically high. And that's one way to look at it. But one of the things that jumped out at me is the Stoic idea that there are no degrees, there are no gradients or there are no degrees of wisdom or of moral goodness. A person is either wise or he is not. So in other words, and one of the analogies that is used is that, well, a man could drown just as easily in 6 inches of water as he could drown if he was placed at the bottom of a lake. And that was in response, that analogy is used when people criticize the Stoic idea that, no matter how much, a person could be working on trying to become wise, but if as long as he has not attained that state of wisdom, he's just as miserable as when he started off. In other words, you don't gradually progress to wisdom. You apparently, according to the Stoics anyway, you study it for a long time, and all of a sudden you magically sort of don this mantle of the wise man. In other words, there's no degrees of wisdom. Now, in fairness, it has to be said that this doctrine was softened over time. This may have been Zeno's original position, but in practice, this probably did not present a problem for Stoic students. And these philosophical schools were just that. They were schools. In many ways, they were almost like, maybe not religions, but they certainly were something that looked a lot like religions in some ways. They were sects, sects, sects. So even though on paper the Stoics may have had a very rigid doctrine about wisdom, about the attainment of wisdom and the lack of degrees of moral development, in practice we can probably expect that this would not have presented much of a problem, because I think that the Stoic teachers did sort of soften this view as time went on, and as a matter of practical necessity, you have to make allowances for people's progress. People don't just wake up one morning and suddenly become something. You have to gradually progress along that path. All right, so now we can move on to Book 4 and to Cicero's attack on Stoicism in Book 4. And I really think this book shows Cicero at his best. It showed that he retained his powers of critical thinking. He never really slavishly threw in his lot with one school or another. He always retained his independence. He always retained his intellectual independence. He had strong Stoic leanings, but he is properly characterized, I think, as sort of a eclectic skeptic in many ways. He was a member of the New Academy. We'll talk a little bit about this in the next podcast, but he was, on paper at least, he was an academic or a member of the New Academy, an adherent of the Platonic school. But he drew freely from all of the philosophical schools, whether it was Stoicism, Aristotelianism, or the Peripatetics, and maybe even a little bit from the Epicureans themselves, even though he despised them. But in any case, he always retained his critical faculties, and that should be a lesson to us as we go through this material. All right, now he starts out his criticisms of Stoicism by basically pointing out that Zeno really didn't. Zeno the Stoic was the founder of the Stoic school, and I talk a little bit about him in the introduction. You can go and read that there. But how much did Zeno really innovate? According to Cicero, the Stoics really didn't do much except give new words to pre-existing doctrines. He just gave new words to pre-existing doctrines. So the alleged derivative quality of Stoic doctrine is something that Cicero harps on again and again in Book 4. Now we could probably respond to this by saying, well, so what? So what if he put his own words on things? Isn't that what teachers or philosophers are supposed to do? I mean, look, there's very little that's original out there, okay? The originality can be seen as arranging things, giving them different names, presenting them in different ways. So Cicero's criticism may or may not be valid. I'll let you decide what you think of that. Cicero then goes on to attack Cato for the alleged Stoic neglect of bodily goods and external goods, which are certainly worth something. Cicero says, hey, wait a minute, you can't just say moral goodness is the end-all, be-all of everything. Bodily goods, health, things like that, health, happiness, bodily pleasures, external pleasures. I mean, these things might not be, the end of goods, but they count for something. They're worth something, and let's not pretend that they don't, because it's not realistic to do so. Okay. The Stoic really forgets that the Stoic forgets the importance of nature's fundamental instincts. Okay. And according to Cicero, Stoic logic is flawed because it represents deductions from inadequate premises, and that he goes into detail about that in Book 4, Section 54. And even worse, he says that the invented terminology the Stoics use is little more than a smokescreen to conceal the fact that they were not really developing any new ideas. Okay. And then Cicero goes on to mock the analogies that Cato uses to justify the severe Stoic view that there are no degrees of wisdom. We talked about the drowning man analogy, but there's also another analogy that Cato uses, which is the blind puppy. It's basically a newborn puppy is just as blind as one that is young, that's been around for a couple days. Okay, so just from a practical, common sense perspective, it's ridiculous to say that there are no degrees of vice or virtue. Nothing could be clearer, Cicero says, than the fact that some things really are more evil than others, and to try to say otherwise is just disingenuous. And the Stoics are guilty of vanity and arrogance in elevating moral goodness as the supreme good, because taking this position will cause us to neglect our health, our careers, our personal affairs, and he talks about this in section 68. And wisdom must be based on something more than just moral rectitude. And this is a very, very important point. The Stoics, had a lot to commend themselves for, but they might have been a little bit too narrow, a little bit too one-dimensional. Now, again, I'm just, paraphrasing and abbreviating a lot of the arguments in books 3 and 4, just to kind of give you, the listener, an idea of what's in my book, because I think this work is really not very well known to most people, and it helps to have someone just give an overview about it. So that's what I'm doing here. I'm going to have to leave it up to you to really dive in and examine these things for yourself. And ask yourself, as you read through, are the criticisms fair? What do I think of the criticisms? Do they hold water for me? Am I sold? Am I convinced that what the speaker is saying is correct? These are the questions that you really need to ask yourself. Because, nobody really has all the answers. Nobody really has the final definitive answer, especially when it comes to questions so fundamental. But, what really makes this book, I think, so courageous, really, really courageous, is it dares. It dares to ask the big questions. And not only does it dare to ask them, it dares to answer them. It dares to propose answers to them. I mean, how many writers today would do this? What philosophers, quote unquote, today would really dare to approach these subjects in a systematic way? These so-called professional, quote unquote, philosophers. There aren't many out there, and they shy away from these subjects because we live in a world where everyone is afraid to pass judgment on almost anything. So keep those things in mind. Really trying to keep those things in mind. And I'm going to post a link to the book in the article that announces this podcast. And again, it's available both in Kindle and also in paperback. And like I said in the first dialogue, the first lecture, if you buy the book in paperback, the Kindle edition is available at a deeply discounted price of $2.99. So that is something to be to think about. You can get the book in both forms. I mean, again, we can go back and forth about which format is the best or which format people like the best. Each one, I think, has something to commend itself for, but I'll let you be the judge of that. All right, so that was our overview of books 3 and 4 of On Moral Ends. And the last, I'll do one more of these in a few days, and that will talk about the conclusion and the roaring finale to On Moral Ends, which is Book 5, which took place at the grounds of the Platonic Academy in Athens. So until that time, I'm Quintus Curtius. Good night.